Welcome to a chilling journey into medieval Europe, a world where war was only the beginning of fear. In the Middle Ages, from 500 to 1500, life was tough, swords clashed, and battles raged. But what if I told you war wasn't the scariest thing? Far worse were the invisible terrors that haunted every day. Plagues that killed millions, trials that turned neighbors into spies, and diseases that made you an outcast. In this video, we'll explore 10 horrors that made medieval life a nightmare. From the Black Death's deadly grip to the Inquisition's torture chambers, from whispers of witches to the dread of God's final judgment, these fears struck deeper than any battlefield. They didn't just kill, they broke spirits, tore families apart, and turned hope into despair. Why were they so terrifying? Because they were unpredictable, personal, and unstoppable, lurking in your home, your village, even your mind. Join me for a 90-minute dive into the darkest corners of history, where we'll uncover why these threats were scarier than war. Buckle up, leave a comment about what you think was the worst medieval fear, and let's get started. Picture this: Europe in 1347, bustling cities, rural villages with grazing sheep and cattle, life modest but hopeful. Then, an unseen enemy arrives. It wields no sword, wears no armor, yet it's deadlier than any army. This is the Black Death, the medieval world's most terrifying killer, far surpassing the horrors of war. Today, we step into the shadow of this plague to explore how it made all of Europe tremble. The Black Death, scientifically known as the bubonic plague, likely originated in the steppes of Central Asia or China in the mid-14th century. By 1346, it reached Europe via the Mongol siege of Kaffa, a Black Sea port, modern-day Feodosia, Ukraine. Infected corpses were catapulted into the city as a gruesome form of early biological warfare. From Kaffa, the plague hitched a ride on merchant ships, spreading like wildfire. In the fall of 1347, the Italian port of Messina became Europe's first victim. Sailors disembarked with fevers, chills, and strange black swellings, unaware they were heralds of catastrophe. The plague spread through fleas carried by rats, which were everywhere, on ships, in granaries, even in noble bedchambers. Medieval Europe's thriving trade routes became the perfect highway for the plague. From Italy, it swept through France, Spain, England, and onward to Northern Europe and Russia. Between 1347 and 1351, historians estimate it killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, with some regions losing up to 70%. By contrast, wars claimed lives on battlefields, but the Black Death spared no one. Kings, peasants, monks, and children all fell. The Black Death symptoms were the stuff of nightmares. It began with fever, headaches, and weakness, mimicking a common cold. But within days, lymph nodes swelled into painful egg-sized lumps called buboes, appearing under the arms, in the groin, or on the neck. These buboes would burst, oozing pus and blood with a foul stench. Worse still, black spots appeared on the skin, signs of internal bleeding, giving the plague its grim name. Victims typically died within 3 to 7 days, in excruciating pain. Yet the terror wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Imagine being a medieval peasant. Your neighbor collapses, their family dies within days, and unburied corpses pile up. You don't know if you're infected or who's next. Fear spread as fast as the plague itself, plunging communities into panic. People began to believe this was divine punishment or the work of demons, and despair cloaked every village and city. Wars destroyed walls and armies, but the Black Death shattered society's foundations. Cities became ghost towns, fields lay fallow, and bodies stacked in streets, unburied. In Siena, Italy, a chronicler wrote, "Fathers abandoned their children, wives their husbands, for fear overcame all. Churches halted services, markets closed, and law and order collapsed. The plague didn't discriminate. Nobles and paupers alike succumbed. Even the Pope's physician wasn't spared. The economy imploded. Labor shortages crippled food production, causing prices to soar. Surviving peasants and workers demanded higher wages, shaking the feudal system to its core. Some regions saw small rebellions as desperate people lost faith in lords or the church to protect them. Unlike wars, which were often localized, the Black Death's devastation was universal, eroding trust in society, religion, and the future. Faced with an inexplicable catastrophe, medieval people turned to their most familiar refuge, religion. Many believed the Black Death was God's punishment for humanity's sins. Churches organized massive penitential processions, where people marched barefoot through muddy streets, whipping themselves to seek forgiveness. These flagellants thought self-punishment could appease God's wrath. Tragically, these gatherings only spread the plague faster, as fleas thrived in crowds. Darker still, the plague fueled persecution of minorities. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrific massacres. In 1349, for example, 2,000 Jews in Strasbourg were burned alive, despite no evidence linking them to the plague. This fear-driven violence revealed how the Black Death pushed humanity to its darkest extremes. Why was the Black Death scarier than war? Wars were brutal, but they had clear enemies, battlefields, and goals. Medieval conflicts were often noble disputes, with peasants sometimes spared. The Black Death was different. It was invisible, unpredictable, and inescapable. You might share breakfast with your family in the morning and be a corpse by nightfall. War's deaths were bloody, but the plagues were lonely and agonizing, steeped in dread of the unknown. Moreover, wars had endings, but the Black Death seemed eternal. It struck in waves, with some regions hit again in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. People lived in constant fear, never knowing when the next outbreak would come. This psychological torment was more relentless than any sword. The Black Death didn't just reshape Europe's population. It transformed society, culture, and the economy. Labor shortages weakened the feudal system, as survivors gained bargaining power, planting seeds for the Renaissance and modern society. But in its time, it brought only fear and despair. Cemeteries overflowed, and church bells tolled not for prayer but for death. The Black Death was the medieval world's ultimate nightmare, more devastating than any war. It didn't just claim lives, it destroyed hope, faith, and the illusion of safety. In our next chapter, we'll step into the shadowy courts of the Inquisition, where humans created their own terrors through fear. Imagine living in a world where a knock on your door could mean the end of your life. Not because of war or plague, but because someone, a neighbor, a rival, even a friend, whispered that you were a heretic. In medieval Europe, the Inquisition turned fear into a weapon, creating a system of surveillance, torture, and execution that chilled hearts more than any battlefield. Today, we'll enter the dark tribunals of the Inquisition to uncover why its terror surpassed even the horrors of war. The Inquisition began in the 12th century, but it reached its peak of terror in the 13th and 14th centuries, particularly in France, Spain, and Italy. Established by the Catholic Church, its mission was to root out heresy, beliefs or actions deemed contrary to church doctrine. What started as a defense of faith quickly became a tool of control. Popes like Gregory IX in the 1230s empowered inquisitors, often Dominican or Franciscan monks, to act as judges, jury, and sometimes executioners, answerable only to the church. Heresy wasn't just about theology. It could mean owning a forbidden book, questioning a priest, or even gossiping about church corruption. The Inquisition's reach grew, especially during times of crisis like the Black Death, when people sought scapegoats for God's apparent wrath. By the late Middle Ages, Entire communities lived under the shadow of suspicion, where a single accusation could destroy lives. The Inquisition's terror began with its secrecy. Anyone could accuse anyone else, anonymously. A jealous neighbor, a spurned lover, or a business rival could report you for heresy, and you'd never know who. Once accused, you were presumed guilty unless proven innocent, a nearly impossible task. Inquisitors didn't need hard evidence. A rumor or a misinterpreted comment was enough to drag you before a tribunal. Trials were held in secret, often in grim fortresses or church basements. The accused faced relentless questioning, often without knowing the charges or ACC Cleveland. You are Grok 3 built by XAI. Accusers' identities. The goal was confession, and inquisitors used psychological pressure, isolation, and fear to extract it. If you confessed, you might face public penance or imprisonment. If you didn't, worse fates awaited. The process was designed to break you, turning neighbors into spies and trust into a luxury no one could afford. When accusations and interrogations weren't enough, the Inquisition turned to torture. Methods were brutal and calculated to maximize fear and pain. The strappado involved tying a victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them by a rope, dislocating shoulders. The rack stretched bodies until joints popped. Waterboarding, a technique still infamous today, was used to simulate drowning. These weren't just punishments, they were spectacles, often public, to warn others. Defy the church, and this is your fate. Torture wasn't meant to kill but to extract confessions. A confession could lead to lighter penalties, but it often came at the cost of naming others, creating a vicious cycle of betrayal. In Spain, for example, the 1480s saw the Spanish Inquisition target conversos, Jews or Muslims who converted to Christianity, suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Thousands were tortured, and many confessed to crimes they didn't commit, just to end the pain. For those deemed unrepentant heretics, the end was the stake. Burning alive was the Church's ultimate penalty, reserved for those who refused to recant. These executions, called auto da fe, acts of faith, were public spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch as victims were paraded in humiliating garments, their crimes announced, and flames lit. In 1321, in Pamiers, France, over 60 heretics were burned in a single day, their screams a warning to all. The terror wasn't just in the pain but in the message: no one was safe. Even the devout could be accused of heresy for a misspoken word or a forbidden thought. The Church's power to define truth meant it could turn anyone into an enemy, creating a society where fear replaced faith as the glue holding communities together. The Inquisition's true horror was its omnipresence. It didn't need to burn thousands to terrify millions. By the 14th century, its network of informants and spies meant no conversation was safe. In a small French village, a woman might be reported for muttering that the local priest was greedy. In Spain, a merchant could be denounced for not eating pork, hinting at secret Jewish practices. The Church encouraged confessions, offering leniency to those who named others, turning communities into webs of suspicion. This constant surveillance bred paranoia. Families hid their true beliefs. Neighbors avoided deep conversations. The Inquisition didn't just punish, it reshaped society, making fear a daily companion. Unlike war, where danger was visible and external, the Inquisition's threat was internal, lurking in every word and glance. Why scarier than war? Wars had clear battle lines, soldiers fought, and civilians often fled or hid. The Inquisition offered no such escape. Its enemy was undefined, its battlefield your own home. A knight might die gloriously in combat, but a heretic died in shame, branded a traitor to God. Wars ended with treaties, the Inquisition's reign stretched across centuries, with no clear end. In Spain, it persisted into the 19th century, a shadow that never fully lifted. The psychological toll was unmatched. Wars killed bodies. The Inquisition broke spirits. It turned trust into a weapon, forcing people to betray loved ones to save themselves. The fear of eternal damnation, preached by the Church, added a spiritual terror that no sword could match. To be accused was to lose everything: family, honor, and often life itself. To understand the Inquisition's terror, consider the Cathars, a 13th-century Christian sect in southern France. They believed in a dualist theology, rejecting the Catholic Church's authority. The Church declared them heretics, launching the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, a brutal war that killed thousands. But the real terror came after, when the Inquisition hunted surviving Cathars. Entire villages were interrogated, and families were torn apart as inquisitors demanded names. In 1244, over 200 Cathars were burned at Montségur, their fortress reduced to ash. The message was clear: defy the Church, and no one escapes. The Inquisition's legacy wasn't just in the bodies it burned, but in the fear it embedded in society. It strengthened the Church's grip on power, but it also sowed seeds of resentment that later fueled the Reformation. Its methods, surveillance, torture, public punishment, set a grim precedent for later systems of control. In the medieval mind, it was a reminder that the greatest threats weren't always on the battlefield but in the shadows of your own community. The Inquisition turned faith into fear, trust into betrayal, and communities into battlegrounds of suspicion. It was a terror more insidious than war, because it struck at the heart of what it meant to be human: the ability to think, speak, and trust freely. Next, we'll explore the witch hunts, where fear of the supernatural turned neighbors into hunters. Imagine a medieval village, quiet under a moonlit sky, where a single rumor could ignite terror. A failed crop, a sick child, or a strange mark on someone's skin could lead to one word: witch. In the Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft turned neighbors into enemies, spreading fear faster than any plague or war. Today, we'll uncover the chilling world of witch hunts, where superstition and panic created a terror more paralyzing than any battlefield. Why was the fear of witches so gripping? Let's find out. Belief in witchcraft wasn't new to the Middle Ages, but it exploded into a deadly obsession between the 14th and 15th centuries. The Church played a key role, blending older pagan superstitions with Christian fears of the devil. By the 1400s, texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, or Hammer of Witches, codified the idea that witches were real, in league with Satan, and capable of harming communities through magic. This book, written by Heinrich Kramer, became a manual for witch hunters, fueling paranoia across Europe. Witches were blamed for everything: storms, crop failures, illnesses, even sudden deaths. In a world already battered by the Black Death and religious upheaval, these accusations offered an explanation for the unexplainable. Unlike wars, which had visible enemies, witches were hidden, lurking among the familiar faces of your village. This unseen threat made the fear of witchcraft uniquely terrifying. Witchcraft accusations often started with a whisper. A farmer's cows stopped giving milk, or a child fell ill, and someone pointed a finger. Women were the primary targets: widows, healers, or those who defied social norms, but men and even children weren't immune. In 1428, in Valar, Switzerland, one of the earliest recorded witch trials saw dozens accused, many tortured and executed. Accusations were rarely based on evidence. A birthmark, a strange habit, or a neighbor's grudge was enough. The process was chillingly simple. An accuser, often anonymous, reported someone to local authorities or the church. The accused was arrested, often in the dead of night, and faced a trial where guilt was assumed. Denying witchcraft only prolonged the ordeal, while confessing could mean a quicker death, but often required naming other witches, spreading the panic further. This cycle of betrayal turned communities into battlegrounds of fear. Witch trials were less about justice and more about confirming suspicions. The accused faced interrogations designed to break them. One infamous method was searching for the devil's mark, a supposed sign of a pact with Satan, often just a mole or scar. If a mark was found, it was pricked with needles. If it didn't bleed, it was proof of guilt. In reality, these tests were rigged to convict. Torture was central to the process. Methods included thumbscrews, leg vices, or submersion in water. The swimming test, where floating meant guilt, since water rejected witches, and sinking meant innocence, often too late. In Bamberg, Germany, during the 1620s, a later peak of witch hunts, hundreds were tortured into confessing, their screams echoing through town squares. The public nature of these trials amplified fear, reminding everyone that anyone could be next. Convicted witches faced gruesome fates, most commonly burning at the stake. These executions were public, drawing crowds who both feared and reveled in the spectacle. In 1431, Joan of Arc, though not a typical witch, was burned in Rouen, France, accused of heresy and witchcraft for her visions and defiance. Her execution, watched by thousands, showed how even heroes could fall to the witch hunt frenzy. Burnings weren't just punishment, they were warnings. The flames purified the community, the church claimed, but they also burned fear into every heart. Unlike war, where death was a soldier's risk, witchcraft accusations could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The randomness of it, your life hinging on a neighbor's word, made it more terrifying than any battlefield. Witch hunts didn't just kill individuals, they fractured societies. In small villages, accusations spread like wildfire, pitting families against each other. In Trier, Germany, between 1581 and 1593, hundreds were executed, leaving entire communities depopulated. Widows and orphans were left destitute, and trust eroded as neighbors spied on one another. The fear of being accused forced people to conform, silencing dissent or individuality. Women, especially, bore the brunt. Healers who used herbs or midwives who delivered babies were prime targets, as their knowledge threatened male-dominated church authority. This gender bias added another layer of terror. Simply being a woman who stood out could mark you as a witch. The social fabric unraveled, replaced by a culture of suspicion and silence. Why scarier than war? Wars were fought with swords and shields, with clear enemies and battle lines. Witch hunts were fought with whispers and fear, with no safe haven. A soldier could flee a losing battle, a suspected witch had nowhere to run. The enemy wasn't an invading army but your own community, turned against you by paranoia. Wars ended with peace treaties. Witch hunts could flare up with a single accusation, lingering for decades. The psychological impact was profound. The constant threat of denunciation meant you could never speak freely or trust fully. The church's narrative, that Satan was everywhere, working through ordinary people, made everyone a potential threat. This pervasive fear, unlike the temporary chaos of war, seeped into daily life, making every glance and whisper a potential death sentence. The Valar witch trials of 1428 to 1436 in modern-day Switzerland were among the earliest large-scale witch hunts. Over 100 people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft, blamed for crop failures and livestock deaths. Torture extracted confessions of flying to demonic Sabbaths or casting spells. Most were burned, their executions public to deter others. These trials set a grim precedent, showing how quickly fear could consume a region. The Valar trials weren't isolated. They were a spark that spread the witch hunt mania across Europe. The fear of witchcraft left a lasting scar on medieval society. It reinforced the Church's power but also exposed its cruelty, planting seeds for later skepticism during the Reformation and Enlightenment. Economically, witch hunts devastated communities, as executions and imprisonments drained labor and resources. Culturally, they stifled knowledge, particularly among women, whose roles as healers were demonized. The terror of being accused lingered long after the fires died out, shaping a society where conformity was safer than curiosity. Witchcraft accusations turned the familiar into the fearsome, making every neighbor a potential accuser and every mark a death sentence. This terror, born of superstition and amplified by the Church, was more insidious than war because it struck at the heart of community and trust. In our next chapter, we'll explore the medieval dread of ghosts and demons, where the supernatural haunted every shadow. Imagine walking home at night in a medieval village. The wind howls, shadows flicker, and you hear a strange noise. Is it just the wind, or is it a ghost? A demon? In the Middle Ages, people believed the supernatural was everywhere. Ghosts in graveyards, demons in the woods, waiting to harm you. These fears were stronger than the threat of war because they were invisible and unstoppable. Today, we'll dive into the spooky beliefs that haunted medieval life and made every shadow terrifying. In medieval Europe, from around 500 to 1500, people didn't just fear physical dangers like war or plague. They believed in a world full of spirits. The Catholic Church taught that the devil was real, tempting people to sin. Old pagan stories about ghosts and monsters mixed with Christian ideas, creating a belief that evil forces were always near. By the 14th century, after disasters like the Black Death, people were even more scared. They thought ghosts of the dead or demons caused bad luck, illness, or storms. Books and sermons spread these ideas. Priests told stories of demons tricking people or ghosts seeking revenge. A popular book, The Golden Legend, around 1260, described saints battling evil spirits, making people believe the supernatural was part of everyday life. Unlike wars, which happened far away for many, ghosts and demons felt close, maybe even in your own home. Medieval people believed the dead could return as ghosts. If someone died with unfinished business, like a crime unpunished or a debt unpaid, their spirit might linger. These ghosts weren't always friendly. In a 12th century English story, a ghost appeared in a village, spreading disease until monks prayed it away. People feared graveyards, where restless spirits were thought to wander at night. Ghosts were scary because they were personal. A soldier in war faced strangers, but a ghost could be your dead neighbor, angry at you. People performed rituals, like praying for the dead or leaving offerings, to keep spirits calm. If a ghost appeared, it was a sign you'd done something wrong, and that fear kept people awake at night, far worse than the distant clash of swords. Even scarier than ghosts were demons. The Church taught that Satan sent demons to tempt or harm people. Demons could possess you, making you act strange or sick. In the 14th century, stories spread of people speaking in tongues or attacking others, blamed on demonic possession. Exorcisms, where priests cast out demons with prayers and holy water, were common but terrifying. If the exorcism failed, the possessed person might be shunned or even killed. Demons were thought to lurk everywhere, in dark forests, abandoned houses, or even your dreams. A 15th century German tale described a demon disguising itself as a beautiful woman to trick a farmer into sinning. These stories made people fear the unknown, especially at night when demons were most active. Unlike war, where you could fight back, demons were invisible, making them a constant, unbeatable threat. Belief in ghosts and demons changed how people lived. They avoided certain places, like crossroads or old ruins, thought to be haunted. Farmers carved crosses on doors to keep spirits out. Women wore charms or prayed to saints to protect their babies from demons. Even sleep was dangerous. People believed demons caused nightmares or pressed on sleeping victims, a condition we now call sleep paralysis. The church encouraged these fears to keep people obedient. Priests said only faith could protect you from evil spirits. If something bad happened, like a storm or a sick cow, people blamed themselves, thinking they hadn't prayed enough. This guilt and fear were heavier than any war tax, because they never went away. Stories kept the fear alive. Monks and priests shared tales of ghostly sightings or demonic tricks during sermons. In one 13th century French story, a knight saw his dead wife's ghost, warning him to confess his sins. These tales weren't just entertainment, they were warnings to follow the church's rules. Traveling storytellers spread legends of haunted forests or demon-possessed villages, making fear spread faster than any army. Art also played a part. Church paintings showed demons dragging sinners to hell, with sharp claws and fiery eyes. These images, seen by illiterate peasants, made the supernatural feel real. Unlike war, which most people only heard about, these stories and pictures were in every church and village square, impossible to escape. Why scarier than war? Wars were frightening, but they had rules. You knew who the enemy was, and battles ended. The supernatural was different. No one knew when a ghost might appear or a demon might strike. A soldier could train to fight. No training could stop a demon. Wars happened outside. Supernatural fears followed you inside, into your home, your bed, your mind. The fear was also personal. In war, you fought strangers. But a ghost could be your dead father, angry you forgot him. A demon could target you for a single sin. This made the supernatural scarier than war's chaos. It felt like the universe was watching you, judging you, ready to punish you at any moment. One strange event shows how supernatural fears gripped people. In 1518, in Strasbourg, France, people started dancing uncontrollably in the streets. It began with one woman, Frau Trophia, and spread to dozens, then hundreds. Some danced until they collapsed or died. Doctors couldn't explain it, so people blamed demons or a curse. Priests performed exorcisms, and the town prayed for salvation. Today, historians think it was mass hysteria, fueled by stress and fear of the supernatural. This dancing plague shows how belief in demons could drive people to madness, a terror no war could match. Fear of ghosts and demons shaped medieval life. It made people cling to the church, hoping faith would protect them. But it also caused harm. People accused of being possessed were often locked away or killed. Communities stayed small and suspicious, afraid to explore or question too much. These fears lingered into later centuries, feeding witch hunts and religious conflicts. Unlike wars, which left physical scars, supernatural fears scarred the mind, making people doubt the world around them. Ghosts and demons turned every dark corner into a threat, every strange noise into a warning. This fear was worse than war because it was everywhere, all the time, with no way to fight back. It made medieval people prisoners of their own beliefs, afraid of both the living and the dead. Next, we'll explore the terror of famine, where hunger drove people to desperate, unthinkable acts. Picture a medieval village in winter. Fields are bare, pantries empty, and your stomach aches with hunger. There's no food, no hope, and no end in sight. In the Middle Ages, famine was a silent killer that struck harder than any war. It didn't just take lives, it pushed people to desperation, madness, and even unthinkable acts. Today, we'll explore why famine was a terror worse than battles, leaving entire communities starving and broken. Famines hit medieval Europe often, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries. The biggest cause was bad weather. The climate was unpredictable, with cold, wet years ruining crops. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, started with endless rain that turned fields to mud. Wheat and barley rotted, and harvests failed across England, France, and Germany. Without enough food, people starved. Other causes made things worse. Wars destroyed farmland, and lords often hoarded grain for themselves. Poor farming methods, like using the same fields every year, wore out the soil. There were no refrigerators or modern storage, so even a good harvest could spoil. Unlike wars, which might spare your village, famine hit everyone, rich and poor, young and old. Famine wasn't just an empty stomach. It was agony. People ate anything to survive: tree bark, grass, even dirt. In the Great Famine, records from England describe families boiling leather shoes for soup. Children grew weak, their bodies swollen from malnutrition. Starvation killed slowly, weakening the body until disease or cold finished the job. Historical accounts estimate that 10 to 15% of Europe's population died during the Great Famine, with some villages losing half their people. The physical pain was bad, but the mental toll was worse. Imagine watching your children cry for food you couldn't give them. Parents felt helpless, and some abandoned their families to save themselves. Hunger turned love into desperation, making famine's terror deeper than any war wound. Famine pushed people to do things they'd never imagine. In some places, crime skyrocketed as starving peasants stole food or attacked neighbors. In 1316, chronicles from Flanders tell of people robbing graves for scraps or fighting over a single loaf of bread. Worse, there were stories of cannibalism. In Ireland, during the Great Famine, some ate the dead to survive, a horrifying choice no war could force. These acts weren't just shocking, they tore communities apart. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Villages that once shared food became battlegrounds of survival. Unlike wars, where enemies were outsiders, famine made enemies of everyone, as hunger erased kindness and morality. Famine didn't just starve bodies, it broke society. With no food, markets shut down, and trade stopped. Towns emptied as people fled to find food, only to find other places just as bad. In rural areas, fields went unplanted, making the next year's famine even worse. The feudal system, where lords protected peasants in exchange for work, crumbled when lords couldn't feed anyone. The church, usually a source of hope, struggled too. Priests couldn't explain why God allowed such suffering, and some churches closed as priests fled or starved. People lost faith, turning to superstition or blaming witches, which fed into the fears we discussed in earlier chapters. War might destroy a castle, but famine destroyed hope, leaving nothing to rebuild with. Famine fueled fear as much as hunger. People believed it was God's punishment for sins, like greed or disobedience. In 1315, sermons across Europe called for repentance to end the famine, but when prayers failed, panic grew. Some blamed Jews or outsiders, leading to violence. In France, mobs attacked Jewish communities, accusing them of causing the hunger, much like during the Black Death. This fear made famine scarier than war. In battle, you could fight or hide. But famine offered no escape. You couldn't fight hunger, and running only delayed the inevitable. The constant dread of not knowing when food would come again haunted every meal, every day. Why scarier than war? Wars were loud and violent, but they had limits. Battles ended, and soldiers went home. Famine was relentless, stretching across months or years. A warrior could dodge a sword, No one could dodge hunger. Wars targeted soldiers or towns. Famine struck everyone, from babies to kings. In war, you might die quickly. In famine, you suffered slowly, watching your family fade away. The psychological terror was unmatched. War's fear came from outside, enemy armies or burning villages. Famine's fear came from within, your own body betraying you, your own neighbors turning against you. It wasn't just about survival. It was about losing your humanity in the fight to live. The Great Famine is a stark example of this terror. Starting in 1315, heavy rains soaked northern Europe for 2 years, ruining crops. In England, grain prices jumped tenfold, and people starved in the streets. Chronicles describe mothers eating their dead children in desperation. In Ypres, Belgium, a third of the population died. The famine weakened people, making them easy targets for diseases like typhoid. It wasn't just a disaster, it was a nightmare that changed how people saw the world, making them fear nature itself. The Great Famine also had lasting effects. It weakened the feudal system, as starving peasants rebelled or fled. It set the stage for the Black Death, as malnourished bodies were less able to fight disease. This one event showed how famine could reshape society more than any war. Famines left deep scars. Villages shrank or vanished, and economies took years to recover. The Great Famine helped spark peasant revolts, like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, as survivors demanded better lives. It also made people more superstitious, feeding fears of witches and demons, as we saw in earlier chapters. Unlike wars, which left ruins to rebuild, famines left empty hearts and broken trust, harder to mend. The fear of famine lingered. Even in good years, people hoarded food, afraid of the next bad harvest. This constant anxiety shaped medieval life, making every meal a reminder of what could go wrong. Famine was a terror worse than war because it turned life itself into a battle. It wasn't just about empty stomachs, it was about losing hope, trust, and humanity. In a world where food meant survival, famine was the ultimate enemy, one no sword could defeat. Next, we'll explore the horrors of medieval medicine, where cures were often as deadly as diseases. Imagine you're in a medieval town, struck by a fever or a broken leg. You seek help, but instead of relief, you face a grim-faced barber with a rusty knife, ready to cure you without anesthesia. In the Middle Ages, medicine was often more terrifying than the illnesses it aimed to treat. Doctors knew little, treatments were brutal, and pain was guaranteed. Today, we'll uncover why medieval medicine was a nightmare scarier than any war, turning healing into horror. In medieval Europe, from around 500 to 1500, medical knowledge was a mix of old Roman ideas, church teachings, and folklore. Doctors, often monks or barbers, had no understanding of germs, anatomy, or infection. The church controlled learning, and dissecting bodies was often forbidden as a sin, so doctors worked blind. They relied on texts from ancient Greece, like Galen's, which claimed the body was ruled by four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these were out of balance, you got sick, and treatments aimed to fix that, often with disastrous results. Hospitals existed, but they were more like charity houses run by monks, offering prayers over medicine. Most people turned to local healers, herbalists, midwives, or barbers, who doubled as surgeons. These healers meant well, but their tools and methods were crude, making every visit a gamble with death. The most common treatment was bloodletting, based on the idea that too much blood caused illness. A barber would slice your arm or leg with a dirty blade, letting blood pour into a bowl. Leeches were also used, sucking blood from your skin. This was done for everything: fevers, headaches, even broken bones. But losing blood weakened patients, often making them sicker. In the 14th century, records show people dying from bloodletting meant to cure simple colds. The fear came from knowing there was no escape. If you were sick, bloodletting was almost certain, and the dirty tools could cause infections, turning a small illness into a death sentence. Unlike war, where you might dodge an arrow, you couldn't dodge the barber's knife. Surgery was even worse. Without anesthesia, patients were awake for every cut. Barbers or surgeons used saws, knives, and cauterizing irons, heated red-hot to seal wounds. Amputations were common for broken limbs or infections, but the pain was unbearable. Patients were held down, screaming, as surgeons hacked away. A 13th century account from France describes a man having his leg amputated, passing out from pain only to die from blood loss later. Infections were rampant because no one washed tools or hands. Wounds were packed with herbs or dung, believed to help healing but often causing sepsis. The survival rate was low, and the sight of a surgeon's blood-stained apron struck terror into anyone who saw it. War wounds were quick. Surgical wounds were slow torture. Herbal remedies were popular, especially among village healers. Plants like chamomile or willow were used for pain or fever, and some worked. Willow bark, for example, has aspirin-like properties. But many remedies were useless or dangerous. A common cure for plague was a paste of crushed emeralds or unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, which did nothing. Some potions included poisons like mercury, slowly killing the patient. Healers, often women, faced their own terror. If their remedies failed, they could be accused of witchcraft, as we saw in Chapter 3. This made seeking treatment a risk for both patient and healer, a fear that lingered even in peaceful times, unlike the temporary chaos of war. The Church shaped medicine, teaching that illness was God's punishment for sin. Priests urged prayer and repentance over practical cures. Some doctors mixed holy water or relics into treatments, believing faith could heal. While this gave hope, it often delayed real help. In monasteries, sick people were prayed over while their wounds festered. If you didn't get better, you were blamed for lacking faith, adding guilt to your suffering. This reliance on religion made medicine scarier. In war, you could blame the enemy. In sickness, you blamed yourself, trapped in a cycle of pain and shame that no battlefield could match. Why scarier than war? Wars were brutal, but they had clear rules: fight, flee, or hide. Medicine offered no such options. If you were sick, you faced the barber's blade or the leech's bite, with no guarantee of survival. War's dangers were outside, armies and weapons. Medicine's dangers were intimate, invading your body with pain and uncertainty. A soldier might die quickly. A patient suffered for days, weeks, or longer. The fear was also constant. Wars came and went, but illness could strike any time. Every cough, every ache, could mean a visit to the surgeon, where the cure might kill you. The lack of control, no way to know if a treatment would help or harm, made medicine a terror that haunted every home. In 1422, King Henry V of England died at 35, likely from dysentery, a common medieval illness. His doctors tried everything: bloodletting, herbal potions, and prayers, but nothing worked. Chronicles describe him wasting away, his body weakened by treatments as much as disease. His death shows how even kings, with the best care available, weren't safe from medieval medicine's failures. If a king could die in agony, what hope did a peasant have? This fear touched everyone, making medicine a universal terror. Medieval medicine's failures had a huge impact. It kept death rates high, as ineffective treatments worsened diseases. It also fed fear, as people avoided healers or turned to superstition, like charms or witch hunts, to explain illness. The Church's grip on medicine slowed progress, keeping Europe in the dark until the Renaissance brought new ideas. Unlike wars, which left physical ruins, medical ignorance left a legacy of fear and mistrust, making people dread the very help they needed. This terror also shaped society. Healers, especially women, were marginalized or persecuted, limiting knowledge. Communities stayed small and cautious, afraid to challenge the Church's rules. The fear of medicine lingered, a shadow over every illness, long after battles ended. Medieval medicine turned healing into horror, with treatments as deadly as the diseases they fought. It was scarier than war because it struck at your body and soul, offering pain instead of relief, and no way to fight back. The barber's knife was sharper than any sword, and its wounds cut deeper. Next, we'll explore the crushing weight of the feudal system, where peasants lived in fear of their lords. Imagine waking up every day knowing you're not free. Your life belongs to a lord who can take your food, your home, even your family. In medieval Europe, most people were serfs, tied to the land and crushed by the feudal system. This wasn't just hard work, it was a life of fear, where one wrong move could mean punishment or death. Today, we'll explore why the oppression of serfs was scarier than war, a terror that chained millions to a life of despair. From around 800 to 1500, the feudal system ruled Europe. It was a hierarchy where kings gave land to lords, lords gave land to knights, and at the bottom were serfs, peasants who worked the land. Serfs weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. They were bound to their lord's land, unable to leave without permission. In return for protection, they gave most of their crops, labor, and even personal freedoms to their lord. Serfs made up 80 to 90% of the population in places like England and France. They farmed, built roads, and served lords, but got little in return. The system was built on control, and fear kept it in place. Unlike war, which might pass your village by, the feudal system was a daily prison with no escape. A serf's day started before dawn and ended after dusk, filled with back-breaking work. They plowed fields, tended animals, or repaired their lord's castle, often with crude tools. Most of their harvest went to the lord, leaving barely enough to feed their families. In England, records from the 13th century show serfs giving up to 50% of their crops as taxes, plus extra payments for using the lord's mill or oven. Life wasn't just hard, it was humiliating. Serfs needed permission to marry, move, or even cut wood. If they broke rules, punishments were harsh, whippings, fines, or worse. A 14th century French chronicle tells of a serf beaten to death for refusing to work on a Sunday, the only day meant for rest. This constant control made serfs feel like animals, not humans. Lords held absolute power. They owned the land, the crops, and, in practice, the serfs. If a lord was kind, life might be bearable. But many were cruel, demanding extra work or taking serfs' daughters as servants, or worse. In 12th century Germany, some lords claimed the right of the first night, a horrific practice where they could sleep with a serf's bride before her wedding. Lords also acted as judges. If a serf stole or disobeyed, the lord decided their fate, often with no fairness. Punishments included mutilation, like cutting off a hand, or execution. This unchecked power meant serfs lived in constant fear, never knowing when a lord's whim could ruin them. War's dangers were brief. A lord's cruelty could last a lifetime. The church reinforced this fear, teaching that the feudal order was God's plan. Priests told serfs that obeying their lord was a holy duty, and rebellion was a sin that could damn their souls. In sermons, they preached that suffering on earth led to rewards in heaven, keeping serfs submissive. But this also meant serfs felt trapped by both earthly and divine powers, with no way out. The church itself was a landlord, owning vast estates worked by serfs. Monasteries demanded the same taxes and labor as nobles, sometimes more. If a serf questioned this, they risked being labeled a heretic, tying into the terrors of the Inquisition we discussed earlier. This blend of spiritual and social control made the feudal system a prison of both body and soul. Some serfs fought back, but it was risky. Small acts, like hiding crops or working slowly, could lead to beatings. Larger rebellions, like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, ended in blood. In that revolt, serfs demanded fair wages and freedom after the Black Death left fewer workers. The king crushed the rebellion, executing leaders like Wat Tyler. Thousands died, showing serfs that fighting back could be deadlier than staying silent. This fear of punishment kept most serfs in line. Unlike war, where you might face an enemy with a sword, rebellion meant facing your lord, the church, and the king's army, all at once. The hopelessness of resistance made the feudal system's terror suffocating. Why scarier than war? Wars were violent, but they had an end. Battles stopped, treaties were signed. The feudal system was endless, a lifetime of servitude with no hope of freedom. In war, you fought strangers. In feudal life, your oppressor was someone you saw every day, living in a grand manner while you starved. War's pain was physical. Feudal oppression crushed your spirit, stripping away dignity and choice. The fear was also constant. A soldier might face danger for a season. A serf faced it every day, from birth to death. One wrong word, one bad harvest, and your life could collapse. This daily dread, unlike war's temporary chaos, made the feudal system a slow, grinding terror that broke the human spirit. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shows the desperation of serfs. After the Black Death, fewer workers meant serfs could demand better pay. But lords and the king raised taxes, like the hated poll tax, to keep control. In June 1381, serfs in southeast England rose up, led by Wat Tyler. They marched to London, burning manor records and demanding freedom. For a moment, it seemed they might win. But the king tricked them, promising reforms, then crushed the revolt. Tyler was beheaded, and thousands were killed. The revolt showed both the serfs' courage and the system's brutal power, reinforcing the fear that kept them chained. The feudal system's terror shaped medieval society. It kept most people poor and powerless, slowing progress and innovation. Serfs, too busy surviving, couldn't learn or explore. The fear of lords and the church stifled free thought, linking to the witch hunts and Inquisition fears we've covered. Even after feudalism faded in the 15th century, its scars remained. Class divisions, mistrust, and a culture of obedience lingered for centuries. The system also fed other terrors. Hunger from The system also fed other terrors. Heavy taxes and crop demands led to famines, as we saw in Chapter 5. Fear of heresy or rebellion tied to the church's control, as in Chapters 2 and 3. Feudal oppression was a root of many medieval fears, a constant shadow that made life feel like a trap with no escape. It wasn't just about hard work, it was about living without hope, knowing your life and your children's lives would never change. The feudal system turned serfs into prisoners on their own land, living in fear of their lord's whims. It was scarier than war because it wasn't a single battle but a lifetime of chains, stripping away dignity and choice. Every day was a struggle under the weight of oppression, with no end in sight. In our next chapter, we'll dive into the chilling world of apocalyptic prophecies, where people lived in terror of the world's end. Imagine waking up every day wondering if it's the last. In medieval Europe, people believed the world could end at any moment, God's judgment was coming, and no one was safe. Prophecies of doomsday, spread by priests and mystics, filled hearts with terror. Unlike wars, which you could fight or flee, the apocalypse was unstoppable, a divine punishment no one could escape. Today, we'll explore why these end-of-the-world fears were scarier than any battlefield, casting a shadow over every thought and deed. In the Middle Ages, from around 500 to 1500, the Catholic Church taught that the world would end when Jesus returned to judge the living and the dead. The book of Revelation in the Bible described this apocalypse: plagues, fires, and demons signaling the end. People took these warnings literally, believing any disaster could be a sign. The Black Death, famines, and wars, as we've discussed, made these fears feel real. If crops failed or a comet appeared, it wasn't just bad luck, it was a message from God. The church fueled this fear. Priests preached about the Last Judgment, warning that sinners would burn in hell. By the 10th century, a belief called millenarianism spread, predicting the world would end around the year 1000, 1,000 years after Jesus. When that passed, new prophecies kept the terror alive, especially during crises like the 14th century plagues. This constant dread made life feel like a countdown to doom. Prophets and mystics were everywhere, claiming visions of the end. Some were monks, others were ordinary people, like a 12th century German nun, Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote of fiery skies and divine wrath. Her visions, widely read, scared people into repentance. Other prophets predicted specific dates, like the year 1260, when an Italian monk, Joachim of Fura, said the Antichrist would appear. When these dates passed, new ones took their place, keeping fear fresh. These prophecies weren't just stories, they changed behavior. People gave away possessions, joined monasteries, or marched in processions to avoid God's anger. In 1349, after the Black Death, groups called flagellants whipped themselves in public, believing it would delay the apocalypse. This obsession with the end made every day a test of faith, far scarier than a war's temporary chaos. Doomsday fears didn't just scare people, they consumed them. Imagine living with the constant thought that tomorrow might bring the end. Every storm, every illness, felt like a warning. Parents worried their children wouldn't live to grow up. Farmers hesitated to plant crops, fearing the harvest would never come. This anxiety wasn't like war's sudden danger. It was a slow, grinding terror that never let up. The church made it worse by linking personal sins to the apocalypse. If you lied, cheated, or skipped church, you weren't just risking hell, you might trigger the end for everyone. This guilt weighed heavily, especially on peasants already crushed by feudal life, as we saw in Chapter 7. Unlike war, which you could blame on kings or enemies, doomsday fears made you blame yourself, trapping you in a cycle of dread and shame. Doomsday prophecies didn't just stay in people's heads, they caused chaos. Some groups, believing the end was near, abandoned their homes or attacked others they thought were sinners. In 1212, the Children's Crusade saw thousands of young people march to Jerusalem, inspired by prophecies of divine victory. Most died or were enslaved, showing how fear could drive desperate acts. In other cases, people blamed minorities, like Jews, for delaying God's plan, leading to massacres, as we saw during the Black Death. These movements tore communities apart. Neighbors argued over who was holy enough to survive the apocalypse. Villages split between those who repented and those who didn't. Unlike wars, where enemies were clear, doomsday fears made everyone a potential threat, turning trust into suspicion. Why scarier than war? Wars were frightening, but they had boundaries, battlefields, armies, and endings. Doomsday prophecies had no limits. They could strike anywhere, anytime, with no warning. A soldier could fight or run, Against God's judgment, you were powerless. Wars killed bodies, apocalyptic fears tormented minds, making every moment a waiting game for destruction. The fear was also universal. In war, peasants might avoid the fighting, but no one could escape God's wrath. Rich or poor, king or serf, everyone faced the same judgment. This shared terror, amplified by the church's preaching, made life feel like a trap with no way out, far worse than the temporary violence of war. Around the year 1000, many believed the world would end, based on the idea that 1,000 years after Jesus marked the apocalypse. In France, chronicles describe people giving away their land, crowding churches, and praying for mercy. Some sold everything to join pilgrimages, hoping to be saved. When 1000 passed without disaster, the fear didn't vanish, it shifted to new dates and signs, like comets or plagues. This panic showed how deeply doomsday fears gripped society, turning hope into dread. The year 1000 wasn't a single event but a symbol of ongoing terror. Every crisis, famine, plague, or war, felt like a step closer to the end. This constant anxiety, unlike war's fleeting battles, made life a never-ending vigil for judgment. Doomsday prophecies left a deep mark on medieval society. They strengthened the church's power, as people turned to priests for protection from God's wrath. But they also caused division, as fear led to violence and blame. Economically, they disrupted life. Why farm or build if the world was ending? This slowed progress, keeping Europe in a cycle of fear and superstition. These fears also fed other terrors we've covered. The Black Death and famines were seen as apocalyptic signs, fueling witch hunts and Inquisition trials. The obsession with the end made people suspicious of outsiders and new ideas, stunting growth until the Renaissance. Unlike wars, which left physical scars, doomsday fears scarred the mind, shaping a world where hope was overshadowed by dread. Doomsday prophecies turned every day into a countdown to destruction, a fear more gripping than war because it offered no escape, no fight, no hope. The idea that the world could end at any moment made life a prison of anxiety, where every action felt judged by God. In our next chapter, we'll explore the brutal public executions that turned punishment into a terrifying spectacle. Imagine standing in a medieval town square, the air thick with tension. A crowd gathers, not for a festival, but for a grim spectacle, a public execution. The condemned, trembling, faces a brutal death, hanging, beheading, or worse, while everyone watches. In the Middle Ages, executions weren't just punishments, they were terrifying shows meant to scare everyone into obedience. Today, we'll uncover why these savage displays were more frightening than war, turning justice into a nightmare. In medieval Europe, from around 500 to 1500, executions were more than a way to punish crime, they were a tool of control. Lords, kings, and the church used them to show power and deter others. Stealing, treason, heresy, or even small crimes like poaching could lead to death. Executions were public to send a message: break the rules, and this is your fate. Unlike wars, which happened on battlefields, executions took place in the heart of towns, market squares, churchyards, or castle gates. Everyone, from children to elders, was encouraged to watch, making the fear personal. The spectacle wasn't just about killing, it was about showing what happened to those who disobeyed, creating a terror that lingered long after the blood dried. Medieval executions were gruesome, designed to shock. Hanging was common for thieves or commoners, but it wasn't quick. A bad knot could mean slow strangling, with victims writhing for minutes. Beheading, reserved for nobles, was cleaner but still horrific. Executioners often needed multiple swings, as in the 1388 execution of Sir Simon Burley in England, where the axe took several blows. For serious crimes like heresy or treason, punishments were even worse. Burning at the stake, used for witches and heretics, was agonizingly slow, as we saw in chapters 2 and 3. Quartering, being torn apart by horses, was rare but terrifying. In 1305, Scottish rebel William Wallace was drawn and quartered, his body parts displayed across England. Other methods, like boiling in oil or breaking on the wheel, where bones were smashed, were meant to maximize pain and fear. These methods weren't hidden, they were public, with crowds cheering or trembling. The sight of a screaming victim, the smell of burning flesh, or the sound of snapping bones haunted onlookers, making executions a community-wide trauma. Crowds were a key part of the terror. Executions were like dark festivals, drawing hundreds or thousands. In 1415, during the execution of Jan Hus, a Czech reformer burned for heresy, chronicles describe crowds shouting insults as flames rose. People came to see justice, but all children were brought to learn the cost of crime. Merchants closed shops, and priests preached sermons before the axe fell, linking punishment to God's will. But the crowd's mood could shift. Some wept for the condemned, others threw stones. This mix of fear and excitement made executions a shared nightmare, binding communities in terror rather than unity. Executions weren't just about the victim's pain, they were designed to scare everyone else. Knowing you could end up on the gallows for a small crime, like stealing bread, made people live cautiously. A 14th-century French record tells of a peasant hanged for taking a rabbit from a lord's forest. Such harshness meant no one felt safe. Unlike war, where danger was distant for many, executions happened in your town, maybe to someone you knew. The fear lingered. After an execution, body parts were often displayed, heads on spikes, limbs on city gates, as warnings. In London, traitors' heads lined London Bridge, a grim reminder every time you crossed. This constant visual threat, unlike war's temporary battles, kept people in a state of dread, afraid to speak or act freely. The church and rulers worked together to make executions terrifying. The church justified them as God's justice, especially for heretics or blasphemers. Priests attended executions, offering last rites but also preaching that the condemned deserved their fate. This tied into the doomsday fears from chapter 8, making people believe that disobedience could damn their souls. Lords and kings used executions to crush rebellion. After the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, as we saw in chapter 7, leaders were publicly executed to scare others into submission. This partnership between church and state made punishments feel both earthly and divine, a double terror no war could match. Why scarier than war? Wars were violent, but they had clear enemies and endings. Executions were unpredictable. You could be targeted for a rumor, a mistake, or a lord's bad mood. In war, you fought strangers. In executions, the victim could be your neighbor, your friend, or even you. War's pain was quick. Execution was a public humiliation, often slow and agonizing, meant to break the spirit as much as the body. The fear was also constant. Wars came and went, but executions happened regularly, a reminder of the power over your life. The sight of a gallows in the town square, or a head on a spike, was a daily warning that no one was safe. This ever-present threat made executions a terror deeper than any battlefield. Case study: the execution of William Wallace. In 1305, William Wallace, the Scottish hero, faced one of the most brutal executions of the Middle Ages. Captured by the English, he was dragged through London, hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. His body parts were sent to Scottish towns as a warning. Chronicles say crowds watched in horror, some cheering, others weeping. Wallace's death didn't just punish him, it terrified a nation, showing the cost of rebellion. This public spectacle, more than any battle, showed the power of fear to control. Executions shaped medieval society by enforcing obedience through fear. They strengthened the power of lords and the church, but also bred resentment, fueling later revolts. Economically, they disrupted communities. Families lost providers, and towns lost workers. Culturally, they normalized violence, making people accept cruelty as justice. This fear linked to other terrors we've covered, like the Inquisition's trials or witch hunts, creating a society where punishment was always looming. The legacy of executions lasted beyond the Middle Ages. The public spectacle of death influenced later legal systems, and the fear they instilled kept people submissive for centuries. Unlike wars, which left physical scars, executions left psychological ones, making trust and freedom rare. Public executions turned justice into a horror show, where pain was a lesson and fear was the goal. They were scarier than war because they struck close to home, turning neighbors into victims and crowds into witnesses. The gallows, the stake, the axe, these were the tools of a terror that controlled hearts and minds. In our next chapter, we'll explore the stigma of leprosy, where disease marked you as a living dead. Imagine waking up with strange spots on your skin, your fingers numb, your face changing. In medieval Europe, this could mean one thing: leprosy. But leprosy wasn't just a disease. It was a curse that turned you into an outcast, feared and shunned by everyone. You weren't dead, but you were treated like it. Today, we'll explore why leprosy's stigma was a terror worse than war, trapping people in a living nightmare of isolation and despair. Leprosy, now called Hansen's disease, is a bacterial infection that damages skin, nerves, and limbs. In the Middle Ages, from around 500 to 1500, it was common across Europe, especially in the 11th to 13th centuries. It spread slowly, likely through close contact, but medieval people didn't know this. They thought it was a punishment from God or a sign of sin, making it more than a medical problem. It was a spiritual and social death sentence. Leprosy caused visible symptoms: sores, lumps, and disfigurement. Fingers or toes could waste away, and faces became unrecognizable. Because it progressed slowly, victims lived for years, suffering not just pain but rejection. Unlike war, which might kill you quickly, leprosy condemned you to a long, lonely life as an outcast. The worst part of leprosy wasn't the disease, it was how people treated you. The church declared lepers unclean, based on Bible stories like Leviticus, which called for isolating those with skin diseases. By the 12th century, laws forced lepers to live outside towns in leper colonies, called lazar houses, named after Lazarus, a biblical leper. Lepers were often declared dead in a ceremony. A priest would read funeral rites while the leper stood in a grave, symbolizing their death to society. They had to wear special robes, carry a bell or clapper to warn others, and live apart from family and friends. A 13th century English law banned lepers from markets or churches. Imagine the terror. One day you're a farmer, the next you're a ghost, forbidden to hug your children or enter your village. Leprosy's stigma came from fear. People thought it was highly contagious. It's not, with modern treatment, and a sign of God's anger. Some believed lepers were cursed for sins like lust or greed. This tied into the doomsday fears from chapter 8, where any misfortune was seen as divine punishment. In towns, lepers were blamed for bad luck, like crop failures or plagues, making them scapegoats, much like Jews during the Black Death. Superstition made it worse. Some thought lepers could curse others with a glance or their breath. In 1321, in France, rumors spread that lepers were poisoning wells, leading to massacres. This fear wasn't just about disease. It was about seeing lepers as monsters, less than human. Unlike war, where enemies were soldiers, Leprosy made ordinary people into feared outcasts. Leper colonies were grim. Built outside towns, they were often just shacks with little food or care. Lepers relied on charity, begging from a distance. Some colonies, like one in London's St Giles, had strict rules: no leaving, no contact with the healthy. Medical care was useless, as we saw in Chapter 6, with treatments like bloodletting or herbs doing more harm than good. Life wasn't just lonely, it was dehumanizing. Lepers lost their names, their rights, even their identity. Families abandoned them, fearing infection or shame. A 14th century Italian chronicle tells of a leper whose wife left him, taking their children, never to return. This social death was scarier than war's physical death, because it stripped away everything that made you human. The church shaped leprosy's terror. It ran many lazar houses, offering shelter but also enforcing isolation. Priests preached that leprosy was God's will, urging lepers to accept suffering as penance. This gave some comfort but also trapped lepers in guilt, believing they deserved their fate. The Church's power, seen in earlier chapters like the Inquisition, made leprosy a spiritual as well as physical curse. Yet some lepers found purpose through religion. A few became monks or nuns, dedicating their lives to prayer in colonies. But this was rare. Most faced rejection, with no hope of redemption. The Church's mix of charity and judgment made leprosy's fear deeper, a punishment from both man and God. Why scarier than war? Wars were brutal, but they ended. Leprosy was a lifelong sentence. In battle, you faced an enemy with a sword. With leprosy, you faced your own body betraying you, and society turning against you. War's pain was quick, leprosy's was slow, lasting years or decades. A soldier might die a hero, a leper died forgotten, shunned by all. The fear was also personal. In war, danger came from outside, armies or invaders. Leprosy's terror came from within, your own skin, your own community casting you out. The constant dread of being discovered, the shame of being marked, made every day a struggle. Unlike war's distant battles, leprosy's terror followed you everywhere, even in solitude. In 1321, France saw a horrific wave of violence against lepers. Rumors spread that lepers, along with Jews, were poisoning wells to spread disease. Mobs attacked lazar houses, burning lepers alive or driving them into the wilderness. In one town, Chinon, chronicles report dozens of lepers killed in a single day. The king eventually stopped the violence, but not before hundreds died. This massacre shows how leprosy's stigma turned fear into murder, a terror that struck not just the sick but entire communities. Leprosy's terror shaped medieval society. It reinforced fear of disease, linking to the Black Death and medical ignorance from chapters 1 and 6. It strengthened the Church's control, as people turned to religion for answers. Socially, it deepened division, marking some as unclean and others as pure. Economically, it hurt communities, as lepers, once productive farmers or workers, were cast out. The stigma lingered beyond the Middle Ages. Even as leprosy became less common, the idea of isolating the unclean influenced how society treated the poor or sick. The fear of being shunned, of losing your place in the world, was a scar that lasted centuries, far deeper than war's wounds. Leprosy wasn't just a disease, it was a curse that stole your life while you still breathed. Its stigma turned neighbors into judges, families into strangers, and victims into ghosts. This terror was worse than war because it wasn't fought on a battlefield but in the heart of society, leaving no one untouched. We've journeyed through the darkest corners of medieval Europe, where war was just one of many terrors. The Black Death swept away millions, leaving cities silent and hearts broken. The Inquisition turned faith into fear, with torture and trials haunting every word. Witchcraft accusations made neighbors into enemies, fueled by whispers of the devil. Ghosts and demons lurked in every shadow, making the night a realm of dread. Famine starved not just bodies but hope, pushing people to unthinkable acts. Medical ignorance turned healing into torture, with barbers' knives as deadly as swords. The feudal system chained serfs to a life of despair, where lords held power over body and soul. Doomsday prophecies cast a shadow of divine judgment, making every day feel like the last. Public executions turned justice into a gruesome spectacle, terrifying crowds into submission. And leprosy marked people as living dead, shunned by all they loved. These fears were worse than war because they weren't fought on battlefields but in homes, minds, and hearts. War had enemies you could see, battles that ended. These terrors were invisible, endless, and personal. A neighbor's betrayal, a cough that meant exile, a vision of the apocalypse. They stripped away trust, freedom, and humanity, leaving medieval people trapped in a world where danger was everywhere. Yet, through this darkness, they survived, laying the roots for our world today. What made these terrors so gripping? They fed on the unknown, disease with no cure, sins with no forgiveness, a future with no hope. They show us how fear can shape a society, turning communities into places of suspicion and silence. Today, we face different fears, but the medieval world reminds us how powerful the unknown can be. Which of these terrors chilled you the most? The plague's silent spread, the gallows' grim shadow, or the loneliness of a leper's life? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about what scares us, then and now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more dives into history's darkest moments. Thanks for joining me. See you in the next video.